All right, everybody, we're going to get started here. Yay, yay, we're back. We're back. So anyway, this is Lost Inwood. We've been doing this for a little over 13 years here now. And we lost our stride a little bit during the pandemic, but we typically do this the first Tuesday of every month. So we're gonna try to get back to that. So welcome. So anyway, most of you know us, but I'm Cole and this is Don. And we kind of take turns. He'll do the next month and I'll do the following month. And we've had a lot of fun doing this through the years and learned a whole lot. The talks have gotten better. So this one's called The Race to Dig. And most of this takes place within just blocks of where we're sitting right now. And the premise is basically that all of Lower Manhattan had been developed. It's the turn of the century. This is still pretty much green space up here, but the subway's arriving, the apartment buildings are starting to go up, and these guys realize that there's treasures buried beneath the soil in northern Manhattan, but they've got a limited time to get it. So it's called The Race to Dig, Saving Manhattan's Past. So here we go. Geographically speaking, I think most of us know where we are. This is a 1908 map of Manhattan, and you can see how built up it is already. And the little circle up there, that's where we are, of course. Yay, the little thing works. And it's still got a lot of green space. The first building went up on Dykeman Street in Broadway, the Salon in Oneida. It's an apartment house that's still there in about 1904, 1905. And then from there, the whole area was quickly developed. And this is our backyard. These are going to be some familiar sights, things you know. And this is the way it was for thousands and thousands of years before we got here. So in several hundred years, we've covered the place in concrete. And it's a land of ancient wonders. Truly, these are photographs shot up in Inwood Hill Park, just right out the window. A glacial pothole. This was caused by melting glaciers about 10,000 years ago. The water just spun around, and literally bored a hole in the rock. These are remnants of glacial boulders that just kind of settled in a way that looks like a cave, not truly a cave. And that's me climbing out of a well, or just standing in a well. I hope Don's going to let me out. When we were exploring the wells and springs of northern Manhattan, there were, in the 1800s, the merchant class built magnificent mansions on the hill. And they needed water, and it turns out you can get water on a hill. So these are photographs, both taken about 1900, and you can see the difference. This is right outside the cafe window. All we're missing is the bridge going across across into the Bronx. That's the lower one. And that's downtown, same year, 1900. Inwood, 1905. This is a penny postcard. So we're standing up on Fort George, and you can see Fort Tryon Hill. You can see Inwood Hill going up. So that's Tubby Hook, that's Dykeman Street running through there. And that's the apartment building I mentioned over there, the Salon in Oneida, the only apartment house in the image. Same image in a photograph, probably separated by a year or two. That's the Dykeman Street station going in on the right-hand side. And the first trains rolled out about 1906. So you see the Palisades in the distance. And then a slightly more modern photograph. This is probably about 1910, I would guess. And this is 207th Street running there. That's the Dykeman House right over there. And that's the first school. That's PS 52. And it was built in the late 1800s, long before the neighborhood had a population that could sufficiently fill the school. And this little house, I've always thought this was cool. This is on Cooper Street, right off 207th. A few more images. Dykeman House is still standing. And interestingly, this gas lamp post is still standing on the corner here. And most of them, just about all of them, except for one in the Greenwich Village, had been removed. And this one was repurposed as they put a street sign on it. So the people just thought it was a post, and they left it there. And uptown, people were finding all kinds of stuff. Keep in mind that this was a neighborhood that was completely under construction. There were subway digs, there was road grading, there were foundations being dug up for apartment buildings. And people, mainly children, were digging through all this stuff and just finding just all kinds of stuff, all sorts of things. There were articles related to the Lenape, the indigenous people who were here for thousands of years. There was a Viking Stone. This turned out to be much ado about nothing, but it's still housed in the Museum of Natural History. All kinds of relics related to the American Revolution. And even, I believe, 3 remains of mastodons were found through the years. 2 on Dykeman Street over by the Ring Garden, and 1 when they were digging the ship canal right in front of us. So it was decided that a group of guys who had been coming up here since probably about the 1880s on digs, they would come up here on Sunday afternoons. They all had jobs, they all had families, and they would dig. They were mainly interested in relics from the Revolution. And so in 1918, the New York Historical Society approached them and said, why don't you just form a team? We'll call yourselves the Field Exploration Team, and we'll fund you. Go out there and dig up as much stuff as you can before we lose it forever. And in return, you just bring your finds back to the New York Historical Society. So the team was born, but most of these guys had been working together for years. And this is what they were up against. Within years of this photo on the left being taken, that's about 1905, you had what's on the right. So by the 19-teens, 1920s, east of Broadway was completely built up. So this is a human story as much as it is a story about archaeology. So we're gonna meet some of the people involved, and these are the team leaders. These are the names that keep coming up over and over again. They're the glue that holds the gang together. You've got William Calver. He's an engineer. He worked mainly on subways, trains, railroads. An old-time engineer, they would call him, Mr. C. So he could take it apart a locomotive and put it back together. And Reginald Bolton, he was cut from a different cloth. He came from an old American family, but before he was born, his father moved back to England, where he was born and raised. And he was a civil engineer, and just an absolute genius. He was I guess what you'd call a Renaissance man. And so in some ways, this is a buddy-buddy story. We're going to see these guys grow old together. And they're pretty easy to spot. They have, almost always, they're wearing the same headgear. Calver's got a long, angular nose. Bolton always has a Van Dyke beard. And he carries a cane, and concealed in his cane, he's got what he calls a sounding rod. And we'll see more on this later. But it was just a tool he created where he could probe the earth. And he was looking for hard, crunchy things, and then they'd dig. More often than not, they would find oyster middens, and this is probably a campfire from Hessian occupation during the Revolution that they're looking at here. So William Calver, again, Mr. C. He was born in Brooklyn, but he was raised mainly in Lackawanna, Pennsylvania, where he got into the railroads. He had a wife named Ella, a son named Homer, and they lived on 136th Street. And again, on weekends, he would come up and meet his friends, and they would dig. I guess it's worth noting that Calver was the head of the Field Exploration Committee. Bolton, again, a Renaissance man, author of 20 books, born in England. He had a wife over there and 3 children. One of them died of consumption, and not long after that, his own wife would die, and he would move to America. He was an engineer. He worked on civil projects. He built elevators. He designed subway systems. He was hardcore, and he was a relic hunter. Those are his children on the left, the ones that survived, Guy and Ivy. And Guy Bolton became a very noted playwright in New York. His daughter Ivy would grow up to be Sister Mercedes, an Anglican nun, and she would write about 10 books herself, many of them history books. And that is his second wife. He remarried when he arrived in New York. Her name was Ethelind, and they had a son together named Homer. So again, civil engineer, very serious guy during the daytime, and really these guys pay attention to the outfits. They wear neckties, they wear nice starched collars, even when they're out in the field. And thank you, Gail Addis, for sending me this, somewhat of a visionary when it came to global warming. And I'm not going to read this, but what he's saying in the first part is that mankind, specifically city dwellers, can raise the temperature of their own atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, and that these numbers will go up in parallel lines as the population and fuel consumption grows. And then the second part is that every civil engineer, particularly people who work in heating and ventilating, have an obligation to decrease waste so that we don't warm the atmosphere too far. And these weren't just passing thoughts. This was a 3-page paper that was very well thought out, and he tried to quantify it the best he could. But again, on weekends, they all came up to Inwood and they dug. And this is a Revolutionary War site on Seaman Avenue, and there again is his sounding rod. And these guys were amateurs. They weren't professional archaeologists. They were kind of just making it up as they went along. And this turned out to be an invaluable tool. As he got older, he realized that he could put the sounding rod inside of a cane, use it as a carrying case, and it was served two purposes. And here's an article where he explains to the archaeological community his new device. He was a prolific author, wrote about just about everything, elevator repair, civil engineering, and several books on the history of the neighborhood. The one right here is particularly nice, and if you go onto the New York Public Library's Inwood Library site, they have a link to an online version of that. And he collected scrapbooks. Now, a lot of these guys took photographs. It became cheaper around this time for people, laymen, to be able to take photos. They would also do what they called magic lantern shows, which is much like what we're doing right now, where they would project images on a screen. And I've seen 2 Bolton scrapbooks. I know the Dykeman House has one, and the New York Historical Society, I've seen another copy. And he would deposit things in his papers with various institutions, I guess, to ensure that some of it survived should something happen to one part of the collection. And here are some talks, magic lantern shows that he's giving at the Salamagundi Club, and he's got another one on the mansions of Upper Manhattan and vicinity, and we've done mansion talks up here. So we're carrying on a century-old tradition here. He was also very involved with the Dykeman House, so much so that there's a Bolton relic room inside the Dykeman House today. That's the room Don and I were standing in the photograph we saw at the beginning of the project. This photograph is about 1890, and it's shot by a gentleman named Ed Wenzel. And we're going to see another painting later where I'm going to point this out, but the fire hydrant here hasn't moved in nearly a century. I'm not saying it's the same fire hydrant, but it's always in the same spot. So there again is the Bolton Relic Room. And a lot of the stuff he discovered, in addition to donating things to other collections, the Museum of the City of New York, the New York Historical Society, a lot of it wound up with the Dykeman House, where it's on display today. And there's the Hessian Hut that at the Dykeman House's request, Bolton and the team reconstructed behind the Dykeman House. You can visit that today. And we're gonna learn a lot more about the Hessians. So the Field Exploration Committee. And this is fun, because what happened is they discovered that children really liked hanging out on the dig sites, and the children became basically their informants. They would dig around playing war, and they would give the hotline a call, and Bolton and the team would come up, and they would dig. Here they are right outside the window of the cafe, and they're digging in a shell midden, which were basically trash heaps that the Lenape maintained. It would keep the animals from getting into any bits of pieces of bone or fish, anything that was organic that was discarded. And it also acted to preserve any artifacts that might remain behind. So they were constantly on the lookout for shell middens. So again, 1918, the field team is formed, and these are their names, and now we're going to look at some of the members. And it's really an incredible group of people just coming from all walks of life and backgrounds. So you got Samuel Hoffman. He was the president of the New York Historical Society, and he really truly wanted to be an astronomer. He studied astronomy, he taught astronomy at Johns Hopkins, and he built his own observatory. But his father got sick. His father was basically a real estate baron, and said, "You got to come back into the family business." So he became a businessman, and later replaced his own father, who had been the president of the New York Historical Society, in that position. You've got John Ward Dunsmore. Now, he's a classically trained artist. He studied in France, in Paris, born in Ohio. He died at the ripe old age of 89. He lived a pretty good life. 30 of his paintings are at Francis Tavern. You can have lunch there and then go up to the museum upstairs where they have a lot of his stuff on display. And the New York Historical Society has another 25 of his works. And he mainly painted scenes from the Revolutionary War. So he was hanging out in the background, sketching and painting as they were digging. Oscar Bark, he was Swedish, a Lutheran. A lot of what I've been able to find out about him was in the Lutheran records. He lived out in Brooklyn. He was a bookkeeper. He also was a cashier at what I understand was a clothing store. Alexander James Wall. He's an interesting character. Look how young he is in this photograph. That's when he starts with the New York Historical Society, and he stayed with the New York Historical Society for the rest of his life. So much so that he became referred to as the Society's ambassador. And there's a long series of letters that you can read, his correspondence between himself and FDR. A friendly, just fatherly figure. His colleagues referred to him as Dad. And his wife, and it's terrific that she wrote this. It's probably about 2 inches thick. It's not a short portrait of her dead husband, but it does cast a certain amount of light into the workings of the field committee. There's a lot of photos in the book, and they're captioned, so you can put the names to the faces, which is great because a lot of the photos we have, we don't know who these people are, and so Entre Nous answers a lot of those questions. For instance, and here's the crew, and they're on Seaman Avenue and 204th Street. And that's Dad, who's circled there. There's Charles Lefferts. He was a career soldier, 1893 through 1921. He became so old that when he enlisted for World War I, they said, we're not going to ship you overseas, and they let him work over at the armory. Now, he was a self-taught artist, but what he was is an expert on uniforms of the Revolution. And his stuff, many of these sketches were published in a book shortly after his death, and they're still used in reference materials today. Edward Hagerman Hall. Now, he was an illustrator, and he was a newspaper man. He was an editor and writer, and he was the son of the mayor of Auburn, New York. And if any of you have ever visited the Poe Cottage up in the Bronx, he was instrumental in making sure that was saved. And one description of him was just the quiet guy in the corner that you probably didn't even realize was with the group, but if it weren't for him, nothing would get accomplished. And everybody says he was an all-around wonderful chap. Charles Thurston, he was the muscle of the gang. He was a bank teller. He lived up in the Bronx off of Sedgwick Avenue. And his son, Bradshaw, you see him on the right there, him and his friends were playing war, and they came across just a magnificent cache of cannonballs and other weaponry. And the team was summoned, and from there on out, Charles Thurston was on board. He was a member of the team. And he often complained that the team would use him to dig out the hole and get all the dirt out, lift the heavy rocks, and as soon as they got near something interesting, they would tell him to step aside. Leonidas Westervelt. Now I call him the Phantom. This is the only photograph I've been able to find of the guy. This is a passport photo. He had a Packard. He had inherited money. He had a chauffeur. He was kind of a member of the staff of the Museum of the American Indian, which had started out as the High Foundation. He was a circus historian, which is interesting. He traveled Europe widely looking for Jenny Lind ephemera. She was a singer who had been discovered by P.T. Barnum. And everybody said he looked like a nobody. His shoes were scuffed up. He dressed very shabbily. But he had a car and he had money. So that's the team. We got Mr. C, we got Bolton, the engineer, we've got the astronomer, the artist, Dad, the soldier, the newsman, the wheelman, and the ox. And these guys, every Sunday, were outside the window digging away. And they became historical celebrities. These were kind of depressing times, you know. We were coming out of World War I. Then this was all kind of interesting, positive news, family-friendly news. Articles really from across the country. This one's from the New York Herald. What do we have here? We have the sun. That's a shot of the inside of the Hessian Hut. These are some of the artifacts that they found. And this is a part of the talk that I like. And are there any kids in the room? That's too bad, because the kids played a vital role in a lot of these discoveries. So again, the neighborhood had been just agrarian society forever. There were bones of indigenous people, artifacts. There were literally colonial cemeteries where there are now apartment houses, and there were just bulldozers and shovels everywhere. There were no playgrounds. There was no real activities for the children to take part in. And they gravitated towards the macabre. Their parents would complain that kids were running around the neighborhood with skulls on the top of mop sticks, and it was just unsightly. This is an Ernest Lawson painting that's in the Barnes collection in Philadelphia, and this is a cemetery that's on 212th Street. That's the elevated subway line that's just entered the neighborhood, and that's the old powerhouse. So Bolton and the gang, a lot of these people were parents, and they had kids, and they realized that this could be a teaching moment, a learning moment, and it also served a twofold purpose. They could teach the kids what they were looking for and send them out into the neighborhood, save them a whole lot of work. But you can see it's the living and the dead side by side. And this photograph, people are literally hanging their laundry in an old colonial cemetery, where so many of the neighborhood's founding fathers were buried. Forgotten even then. And I gotta think, from the time that Bolton spent in England, he would have said this with a pretty thick accent. But he's talking about teaching the kids what to look for and how excited they are when they find something of interest. And this is from the Bolton scrapbook. That's Bolton in the background there. And so you'll see children and neighbors and cops and shopkeepers in so many of these shots. And John Ward Dunsmore, the artist, he's standing there. He's aged a bit since his self-portrait. And this is the find. And this is on 3321 Giles Place in the Bronx. I'll show you a map in a second, because Giles wasn't a familiar street to me. But this is the cache they found. So there you have Bolton. You have the ox standing there. Now you know what to look for. He looks like Sean Connery to me, kind of in the Untouchables. And just this pile of stuff. There's cannonballs, there's bar shot. These are heavy too. They're heavier than they look. This kid's got some chain shot there. So a lot of this stuff was really to be used when you're firing at ships. It gets caught up in the rigging and just wreaks havoc. For the Revolution, for 7 years, it was mainly an army of occupation. They had not a whole lot of use for this stuff. And these were probably American munitions that were buried as the Americans fled, as the British moved in. That's the theory, anyway. They think it was the location of Fort Independence. So there it is. The red dot is what we're looking at, not too far from the UPS store. And more children. This is on Seaman Avenue. The next couple of photographs are going to be from Seaman Avenue. And you can see the roads being graded. And it doesn't require much work. Bolton's got his cane there. And you see the kids are digging through what looks like a shell midden. And so we've got layers of history. We've got the Lenape. We've got the colonial settlers. We've got the Revolutionary War relics. So part of it was separating, what's what. Bolton's there explaining what they're doing to a little young girl. Calver's sitting in the hole, and there's a policeman onlooker. There's always an interesting cast of characters. Everybody always has hats, except for the guy on the left there. The two girls there, they look like the twins from The Shining. And Calver's there. You start to recognize who's who after a little while. And there's the team. They're on probably between Seaman and Payson Avenue, and that's Hut Camp 36. And what they do is they number the sites, and then you get corresponding numbers going to the descriptions and the photographs, and it makes it kind of user-friendly. once you've seen enough of them. So we're going to peel back various layers of history. We're going to start with the Lenape. They were the first ones here before the Europeans arrived. And I'm going to go with, let me just explain what this is. The stuff from the Lenape I pulled from Eric Sanderson. He just does such a beautiful job of explaining what's what. And this is a kind of a reimagining of what Manhattan would have looked like before any development at all. And it's just green and beautiful. And that's, just right where we are in here. That's Inwood Hill. So we're talking about the Lenape, the Lenape, the Muncie, the Delaware. Up and down the East Coast, they were referred to as the ancient ones by their peers. Algonquin. This is a portrait, and this is a very old portrait. This is 1735. This is not a modern reimagining of what the people would have looked like. And this is from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And this is another shot of they call them the Indian caves. They're really just rocks that kind of tumbled to look like caves. This is a diorama that Calver built. And I think this thing is still housed in some museum somewhere. There's an early archaeologist just inside the mouth of that. So they're not very deep. Probably what they did is they pulled animal skins like a tarp over the outside. You could use it for storing food and whatnot. Certainly useful. And then here's the gang again, right outside the window. That's Inwood Hill there. And that's where the Henry Hudson Bridge would be today. So we're going to examine what these shell middens look like. But again, they were just refuse heaps, and as you sifted through them, often you would find artifacts of interest. To give you an idea of what the encampment would have looked like, and they believe it was probably just a seasonal thing. They were here during the warmer months. The area just out in the Spuyten and Duyvil, which was so shallow that it was referred to as the waiting place. It was deepened and widened by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1890s. But this is kind of what they think it would have looked like. And they had these bark huts. If you go over by the Nature Center, there was a bark hut that they built. It's got to have been 15 years now, and it's still standing. It's holding up pretty well. You can see what they would look like. And here's a shell midden. And they were literally consuming oysters by the thousands. And when you walk up in Inwood Hill today, if you just kick your foot around in the ground, you'll find some oyster shells. So this is what it would look like as they dug it out. They're all compressed. You got Bolton's sounding rod and his cane, and maybe some ducks for scale. And there, Bolton and William Hagerman Hall, the newspaper men, that's Calver on the right, looking through one of the shell pits. That's 212th and 10th Avenue. And this is one of their most impressive finds, and one of the ones they were most proud of. And this is as they were regrading the streets, or actually grading the streets, because there were no streets to begin with, construction workers would often uncover stuff. And this was in a void in the soil. It was just amazing that it was undamaged, but this was an intact vase. And you can see that the local cultures of the northeastern seaboard were certainly connected, because this is a similar pot that was found in Delaware and Muncie territory. And the patterns are almost identical. Other pots that they had pieced together through shards were found, many of them outside the window again. They called this area out where the Gaelic field is now the Cold Spring, because there was cold water that was reliably bubbling out of the soil. So the Lenape made use of that. The early settlers made use of that. And then a guy named Pop Seeley, who was running a refreshment stand out there selling soft drinks and beer to people on boats, he plugged it up with concrete to increase his profits. And it's recently been uncovered. It trickles out a little bit. And so the field exploration team, they weren't the only people digging up here. Now we're going to turn to Skinner and One Road, Lanson Skinner and Amos One Road, mainly because these are the two that were interested in the Lenape artifacts. They would collaborate with the field exploration team somewhat, but The Lenape were their territory, and the Revolutionary War artifacts were again what the field team focused on. So this is like Calver and Bolton, kind of another buddy-buddy story. This is just two co-workers, two best friends, and a very complicated relationship. Lanson Skinner, so the story goes, just started showing up. He lived in Staten Island with his parents. Really didn't come from much, and just started showing up at the Museum of Natural History, which I think had been founded around 1880, asking to help and showing them things he had found on Staten Island, arrowheads and whatnot, and he just would not go away. Year after year after year, when they opened up, he was on the front steps, and finally it was decided, well, he's interested, and the museum paid for him to go to college and study indigenous cultures and archaeology, and these were all new and exciting fields. And from there, after his graduation, they sent him off. Amos One-Road grew up on a reservation. He was a Dakota Indian. He lived in South Dakota. And he was taken under the wing, came to school at Columbia University, and was taken under the wing of George Gustav High, who was the head of the High Foundation, which later became the Museum of the American Indian. And High paired these two and sent them off into the world. And they went all over the place. Clearly, this neighborhood was closest. The High Foundation was located in Washington Heights, but they also went down to Florida, out into the Dakotas, and even down into South and Central America. And Skinner became something of a celebrity himself. There he is down in Florida. He was born in Buffalo. That's kind of a cool photo. And anyway, he was considered to be a friend of the Native Americans. He was much more sympathetic. He'd spent a lot of time on various reservations. There's Amos, and Amos One-Road was a full-blood, and forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, Sisseton, Wahopton, Dakota, and a grandson of the hereditary chief Wakanto, a well-known historical figure in Dakota history. And it's unclear to me, how he was discovered by George High, but George thought very much of him, and gave him credit in the various books that were published by the society. Amos is always given credit for his finds. And this was at a time when Native peoples received some pretty rough treatment. So these were complicated relationships for both of them. Lanson Skinner had to go out onto the reservations where he clearly did not blend in, and the natives nicknamed him Little Weasel, which kind of cut both ways, because a weasel never comes home empty-handed. You can see him eyeing that skull there. But a weasel is still a weasel. And Amos One-Road, and this is difficult. He described himself in his autobiography called Being Dakota is walking in two worlds. And his official title for the museum was informant, which is not a great job title in any period of history, I would think. This is his draft registration. He wound up serving in the Coast Guard with an honorable discharge. He served bravely, and he lists his employer, and he truly is walking two worlds. His employer is George Gustav High, the industrialist, and his nearest relative is his mother Nancy, living on a reservation on Wood Lake in northeast South Dakota. So let's get to what they discovered. So we're going to focus just on their uptown digs, because that's why we're here. These are some of the papers that they wrote on the area, and some of the finds they were writing about had been discovered by the field exploration team. And you'll see One-Road is always given credit for his roles in any of these discoveries, which I think is commendable given the time. When I talk about the two groups collaborating, these are finds by Skinner and One-Road, and a map. Now Bolton was just a magnificent cartographer of the sites. So this is Dykeman Street, where it hits the Hudson River, the area we call Tubby Hook. Several years ago, there was La Marina. Now there's I can't remember the Hudson. I think the restaurant is called. And the Magdalen home, we've given a whole series of talks on institutions. That was a home for unwed mothers. It later became the first home of the Jewish Memorial Hospital. And so these are arrowheads that the two discovered at the foot of Dykeman Street. And there's one from the collection. I think that's Don's gloved hand there. And you can see how small they are. They're delicate little things. So these are Lenape arrowheads. And these are scattered around in various collections. I think these are from the Museum of the American Indian, which are downtown. And there was evidence of trade. These are arrowheads from the collection of William B. Isham. Isham Park, he was a leather merchant. Thank you very much. So these are arrowheads that would have come from the Middle America. And they believe they're evidence of trade, but there's always the possibility that somehow these arrowheads got mixed in with other arrowheads from the collection. We'll really never know. But going into the shell middens, the oyster pits again, those they could figure out that these are definitely shell middens that were, laid there by native peoples and mixed in, and this is just evidence of European trade. They would find, just little things, glass beads, musket balls. This is a pewter ring. They believe this is German. It's an early design for the New York Yankees. And all kinds of tools. And keep in mind that they're only finding things that are going to survive the test of time. So you're not going to find metalwork because there was no metalwork. So it's whatever didn't decompose. So these are bone awls, needles. Again, this is found in Cold Spring, which was the spring right out the window in what is now the Gaelic field. And teeth of all kinds of animals. You would find refuse from meals in there too. So that's how the animal teeth probably wound up in the shell middens. And this, I think, was probably one of the most exciting finds. It was a pendant, an effigy, and it's meant to be hanging probably on a strip of leather so that it would face upside down when it was worn around your neck. And then again, that was found just right out there, near where the boulder is, where the tulip tree once stood. And what might have been. So they're only finding things that didn't break down. But some things were preserved. Again, we're going to go back to, this is actually from the Museum of the City of New York. But this is some sort of a staff. So you've got leather and wood and copper inlays. Things like this would have just been destroyed by nature. And this is really cool. Look at the bottom of this staff. It's a foot. If you go down there, right there. And then tragedy strikes. The two are out on a fact-finding mission out in North Dakota in the car together. The car's going up a hill. The motor stalls out, starts sliding backwards, goes into a ditch. A Lanson Skinner is killed. He's 39 years old. And Amos One Road, his best friend, his assistant, his lifelong partner, survives unscathed. But he's just emotionally crippled by the event and kind of just drops off the radar. This is a letter he wrote to George Gustav Hyatt. It's heartbreaking. Why was I spared? I'm doing the best I can by trying to have a little bit of sunshine in my heart. And I don't know as I will ever find another friend, with a capital F, like him. And that chapter closes, but they did leave behind things that we can read and research today. The two on the left are a little bit dated, but Being Dakota is definitely worth a read. You can find that on Amazon. So now we're going to turn to the Revolution in the Heights, and we turn back to the Field Committee. So it's again, it's an army of occupation from 1776 to 1783. It's British and Hessian troops occupying Manhattan. There are skirmishes, but mainly these soldiers are encamped on Inwood Hill, living in wooden huts in the wintertime, canvas tents in the summertime, exposed to the elements, starving, complaining, drinking, gambling. And it's 7 years of this in a foreign land. So this is a 1776 sketch, and what you're looking at here is Inwood Hill. New York's last virgin forest is nearly denuded. They needed the wood for fortifications, for fuel, to stay warm, for cooking. They probably chopped down just about every tree that was there. When they arrived, there were Boweries, farms, along the Harlem River that would have been owned by the Dykeman and Nagel families. The Dykemans, they fought with the rebels. They acted as guides and scouts, and as retribution, when the British left in 1776, they burned down the Dykeman's ancestral home. So the Dykeman house that we know today was built several years after that. And just to see the difference a few hundred years makes, we've got a bridge now, but really not much has changed about this view. So in 1882, something incredible happens. The New York Historical Society publishes a journal. It was written by John Charles Philip Voncraft. And this guy is almost, his tale, it reads like a tall tale. It's almost unbelievable. He starts out in Germany. He's from a lower noble family, and he wants a commission in the military. And so he sets off to Canada and tries to get involved with the troops up there. He speaks very little French. He's treated as an outsider. They're abusive. He goes back to Europe, catches another ship, and winds up in our neighborhood in a camp right off of Seaman Avenue. So he's here for a number of years, and his journal it's a diary. It's just day to day what's happening. I ate this. So-and-so is cavorting with a neighborhood woman. There's gossip. He talks about fighting, drinking, a lot of complaining, and he talks about illness and disease a lot. He's bored. I barely believe the guy existed, but sure enough he did. He stays in the United States after the Revolution. While he was here, and he does not mention this in his journal, he secretly married an American widow. And he winds up working, I believe, as a cartographer for the Department of the Treasury, and he's buried in Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. So he's the real thing. And the Field Exploration Committee, reading his writings, must have thought more or less the same thing, until they broke out the maps, and they're very detailed maps, they're accurate, and they're labeled. So they start just site by site, going to his letters on the map and digging, and it's a veritable treasure map. A lot of their work is done. And this is from Voncraft's journal. This is one of his first entries in the neighborhood. This is December 25th, and I didn't note the year there. But the first Christmas holiday up to now we had, with the exception of a few cold days, quite warm weather with thick, stinking fog mixed with rain, so that we had to apprehend many cases of the sick. And so sickness was mainly a wintertime thing. And when people got sick, they would build a tent camp nearby, maybe down on Dykeman Street, and send the sick down there until they got better. And this affected both sides. So he writes quite a bit about fever, but he's always got a sense of humor about things. He's got this wry sense of humor. He fears that he's dying of this fever. My sighs can no longer move God. I would be glad to die were it not that I die a sub-officer. and then again, this is one of his maps, and it's recognizable today. And medical treatment was not what it is today. This is a few years later. I bled my left arm, and some of his entries are really this brief, many of them. So they take His treasure map, his map of the Revolution, they lay it over modern street grids, and they go to work. So the first site we're going to look at is Fort Washington in what's today West 183rd Street. I like this map. It's 1930. It's a little late for the time, but it's got a nice graphic. So this is one of Voncraft's maps. And then Bolton, again, remember he's a cartographer. He takes his map, redraws it, lays it over a street grid, and each place they dig, it's incredibly accurate. So here's the site. This is 1922, and this part of the neighborhood had already been somewhat developed, but there's some fresh soil there. Again, you see children in the shots, children in hats. And this guy, you don't see a lot of guys with sunglasses. He's got some nice sunglasses because he's a vampire. Okay, so you found stuff that you'd expect to find. Bullets, bayonets, cannonballs, buttons by the pile. But some of these things were a little bit more rare. These are souvenirs that people would have taken home of their service. I get the feeling that a lot of the soldiers on Evacuation Day actually burned their uniforms, because you would find just dozens of buttons inside the fireplaces of the abandoned huts. But not too many of their breastplates, the belt plates, the clips. Keep in mind that there were no zippers, there was no Velcro. You needed buttons or something to clip all your gear on. And of course, the cannonballs, the musket balls. Don was thinking about bringing a cannonball tonight. He said it was too heavy. Yeah. And then things that you would just need in day-to-day life. Again, 7 years just sitting around with not a whole lot to do. Inkwells, shovel blades, marbles. And lots of china. Now this is something a soldier wouldn't bring across an ocean with him. So when the troops first got here, the British troops, the Hessian troops, Hessians were essentially German conscripts, they were told to fend for themselves. You need to feed yourself, go raid one of these boweries, one of these farms. Just take what you need. So in addition to food and all kinds of other liberties, you would find in the revolutionary rubbish pits at the campsites various pieces of broken pottery. And toys. 7 years, a lot of lonely men. A lot of them probably took on wives, fathered children, but there's evidence of children, and lots of evidence in just about any of the dig sites. So children were running through these camps. The next site we're going to go down to is, or up to from Fort Washington, is Fort George. Up where George Washington High School is today, that old hill that goes up the road from the subway. And for many years, so what we're looking at here is that's Dykeman Street, and that's the hill going up. And the subway has probably been running about 5 years at this point. You see horses and carriages are still doing most of the driving. And so what did they find up at Fort George? Some cool stuff. I believe this is a Calver find. And so that's a lion, and that's basically a buckle there. And so that would have been included in one of their books. That might be from Relics in the Revolution. And this is today housed in one of the collections downtown. Again, Fort George was most notable of recent years for being an amusement park. It started in, I believe, about the 1880s. It burned down twice. Both times they suspect it was arson. The amusement park attracted all kinds of vice, drinking, noise, you name it. Residents didn't want that in their backyard, and they think they took things into their hands twice and burned it down. Second time it was not rebuilt. They turned part of it into a park. George Washington High School is up on the hill today. And in the early 1900s, it was a prime dig site for relics of the Revolution. And then we move on, again from Voncraft's map. He told them where to look for the hut camp of the 17th Regiment. And this is where, when we see the Hessian Hut out behind the Dykeman house, this is where they found all the huts. They were expecting to find a handful of them. They found 60 in all, 60. And between Voncraft's maps, and as they were digging, they discovered that through the years, as the roofs of the huts had collapsed in, the Dykemans, they had an orchard, had planted trees in each of the huts. So they would look for a tree, and they could dig near the tree and be relatively certain they would find a hut. So there's Voncraft's map. He tells them where to look. And there's John Ward Dunsmore, the artist, the Parisian-trained artist from Ohio. That's his rendering of what the officers' huts would have looked like. Now, the officers' huts, the one behind the Dykeman house is in fact an officer's hut, were a little bigger than the enlisted men. And so basically you've got 3 walls, you've got kind of a sod roof with timber and then more timber in the front. And window panes would have been a real luxury, and if they had them, they would have been from looting the houses, nearby, or more likely the shops downtown. Again, didn't really make them friends of the local populace, and they would have just been terrible places to live. The water would have flowed in the springtime. In the wintertime, they would have been bitterly cold. They would have been smoky. You see, they built a chimney out of a barrel. The one over the Dykeman house, I noticed that they allow some light in by putting old bottles into the masonry. Not enough to see through, but enough to let a little light in. So the Hessians, again, German conscripts. That's a Hessian uniform. That's Charles Lefferts who drew that, the soldier. And this is a more modern rendering. This isn't a period piece, but this is 1776 when Manhattan falls. And Margaret Corbin, you see her sitting there. There's Corbin's Circle down in Fort Tryon. Her husband was manning the cannon. He was shot and killed, and for a period of time, legend has it, she took over the cannon. And the field exploration team would actually, years later, explore what was believed to be her grave up in West Point. And here we go back to Voncraft. I've put some of his quotes in from time to time. The fever increases every day, and now is commencing in other regiments as well, as all over the island. So what you see in the red circle is the Hessian Huts, the line of Hessian Huts, and in front of it is what they called their summer camp. Once the winter was over and it got a little more tolerable to be outside, they would set up tents in the fresh air. They could also set up something similar for a quarantine camp. And you can see this is a Bolton map, and there's just layers of history here. You've got Revolutionary War relics. It says there double Indian burials, shell beds. So there's stuff buried under pretty much any apartment building you live in the neighborhood. And these guys were able to salvage some of it before it was all covered up. So they didn't realize they were going to find so many huts. They started out lettering them. They went A to Z, and there were still dozens of more huts to uncover. So the early ones have both a letter and a number. So we're going to take another look at Hut T. So what we're looking at, this is pretty much Payson Avenue right there. So Payson Avenue, Seaman Avenue is coming over here. There's going to be a landmark here. So this is Hut Site T. There's a dog in the foreground, kids in the background. And pay attention to this rock, because this will give us an idea of exactly where we're standing. Because again, these are apartment buildings where they are right now. And people all over the country were following these finds. That's the Macon Beacon there. So see the rock? The rock. And again, this is roughly where Seaman Avenue is today. So you had Native American habitation. Then you had colonial settlers living on that. For a while, more residential houses like you see in the background, and today apartment buildings. So the neighborhood has changed quite a bit. And Prescott Avenue is now Payson Avenue. And there's that rock today. These guys said, hey, what are you taking a picture of? So I went over and I showed them, and then they had me email them the picture, and they sent it to their wives. So history is exciting. John Ward Dunsmore, same site, same rock. This isn't his best work. But you can kind of make out, that looks like at least Bolton. Where did this go? That looks like Bolton there. And so they found a lot of fireplaces. Each of the huts would have had a fireplace in it. They would have found bake ovens, smaller fireplaces that would have been near the summer camps, that would have been outdoors. So they had a lot of barrels that they were shipping over. A lot of your goods, your flour, your grains, whatnot, came in barrels. So they would repurpose the barrel hoops so you could hang a pot over the fire. And then the bar shot, which they weren't making much use of, they would put in the floor of the fireplace, kind of like you have an iron cage in the bottom of the fireplace today to let the air in so the fire can breathe. And again, many buttons were found in these fireplaces. And Calver, I like to call him the button man, he was obsessed with buttons. Bolton was kind of interested in everything, but Calver focused on buttons. And these look like actual buttons, don't they? But these are actually sketches. These are drawings that he's done. So he was an incredible draftsman. And this is and he would correspond with his European counterparts and send them, these descriptions, because buttons could tell you a lot. You could learn what troops were there, what regiments they were from, and from the buttons and knowing what regiment they were from, you can find out who was enlisted, who was commanding them, how long they were there, and piece together a story. So it looks like he's planning on giving a talk similar to the one we're giving tonight, and his is going to focus on buttons. There he is, exchanging correspondence with a counterpart in Scotland. And you can see this is the 38th Regiment, the 37th. They're all a little different. So it's pieces of a puzzle. And Voncraft again. So this is what they think was a bake oven. They would we'll read Voncraft's description. It's basically the food was terrible and there's not enough of it. But a soldier attached to the regiment came and brought us some bread. But my God, how frightened we all were when we saw what it was, and what terrible stomach aches we had after eating only a little of it. For it was nothing but oat grits, which had been impossible to bake through. So food was scarce, and a lot of times when it came over, it was more or less spoiled. Cartridge Box. This is from the collection of William Calver. This is something, and most of the uniforms, and it's the reason they call them uniform, everything's uniform. But sometimes the officers would be allowed certain embellishments. Then the more ordinary artifacts of war, the bayonets, the canteens. Again, found right off Seaman Avenue. And drinking galore, my God. When one of the roofs on the huts would collapse, they'd use it as a trash heap and just fill it with bottles. They found bottles everywhere. And for some reason, most of the bottles were being imported from England. Bottles were locally produced, but, and it turns out you can make a corkscrew from just about anything. And they had corkscrews. So I like this one. As it was my birthday and rained hard, I remained home and in solitude, drank a bottle of wine. But my contemplations made my heart heavy. I'm sure it must have been hot in August of 1779 on Inwood Hill drinking a bottle of wine. They learned quite a bit about bottles and stemware. And you can see it as the war progresses, the stemware gets a little larger. Even the bowls and the tobacco pipes get a little wider and a little deeper. These are clay pipes. They were found everywhere. And this was probably made out of a musket ball. They would take the lead and just hammer it into a die and use it for gambling. A lot of marbles. There's Calver examining a pipe. And things you would need in day-to-day life. You can make a corkscrew from anything, so can you a fork. That's a brush for combing your hair, and of course scissors. Thimbles. These are the men who were out in the field and they had uniforms and buttons and needed to fix their own clothes. I find it interesting that a wig cooler, but a wig curler would be needed. Sitting on the side of a hill with your friends for 7 years, but fashion was fashion. Trowels for digging the huts. And pencils galore. And the pencils were Voncraft's best friend. And when you think about it, a soldier in his capacity probably shouldn't have been keeping a journal like this. Day-to-day troop movements, activities, maps. Had he been caught with that, his life might have met a different end. And again, evidence of children. This is again from the hut camp. Tiny pewter plates. These are just little toy things They called that a child's buzzer. I'm not really sure what that was. You know what a child? What's a child's buzzer? Oh, you're right. Yeah, you'd pull it back and forth, and it would start spinning. I forgot about those. So the Hessian Hut. So at the Dykeman Foundation's request, they had dug up 60 huts. And I've given this talk online before, and a common question is 60 huts. A modern archaeologist would leave something behind for future generations. Did they do this? No, they didn't. They dug the place, they drank the well dry, so to speak. So they didn't really leave anything behind. Of course, it would have been buried under concrete, so kind of a mixed bag on that. But the Hessian Hut, the Dykeman said, yeah, can you reconstruct one behind the house? So they did. And it's wonderful that they did, just to refresh you on what they would have looked like in their natural surroundings. We got Dunsmore again. And so they rebuilt Hut 34. It was an officer's hut, again, a little wider, a little deeper than one of the enlisted men's hut. This is a nice aerial, and you can see apartment buildings are already starting to pop up in the background. There's the inside, and this is really timeless. I have a photograph. I didn't bring it tonight of the two of us having a glass of wine inside the hut during some kind of a benefit event. But it's a neat space, and I think it's the timber's been replaced once or twice through the years.
What?
How many times has the timber been replaced that you know of?
Can't hear you.
The timber, the roof.
Oh, in the 60s they were replaced.
It was replaced in the 60s, so they hold up pretty well.
Yeah.
Voncraft, again, imagine living in one of these through a New York winter. For a few days past there's been such a persistently cold wind that many of the men had ears, hands, and feet frozen. And Voncraft complains at one point he steps on a barrel hoop. And you know how something like that can flip up and cut you in the leg? And he was terribly afraid that was going to be the end of him, that he was going to die from the infection. Again, another shot of the hut today. Again, behind the Dykeman farmhouse. And Evacuation Day. This is the day that the British were shown out of Manhattan for good. Voncraft writes this from a ship leaving New York Harbor. Remember, Voncraft doesn't really leave. He winds up back in Washington. He's married an American widow. But as he's leaving Manhattan, he writes, "My whole heart is full of sadness when I see fading from my view the receding landmarks and housetops in whose midst I leave my whole happiness behind me." That's kind of hard to believe, because he had a pretty miserable stay. And he was a fighter, he was a womanizer, he drank a lot, and was reportedly in 22 duels, some of which he was injured in. So he was a character. So layers of history, they don't always line up perfectly. So we're going to go back a little bit, but they do overlap, and talk briefly about the Dutch settlers. And the talk kind of winds down from there. So we're talking about mainly two families, the Dykemans and the Nagels. So Jan Dykeman, Jan Nagel. I don't know if they knew each other before here, but they were certainly good friends. The families intermarried through the time in the neighborhood. They wound up owning most of the property in northern Manhattan. Again, they ran boweries or farms right along the old Bloomingdale Road, which is now Broadway. So there was a route downtown. Often people bringing their cows to slaughter downtown would overnight at the Dykeman Farm. That might be what's happening in this lithograph. And again, many of the street names are named after them and other families, the Vermilia and whatnot. So these are their homes. Again, the Dykeman Homestead was burned down sometime around Evacuation Day, because they had sided with the rebels. The Dykeman farmhouse today probably incorporated some of the surviving materials, so a bit of it might live on. But again, it was burned down and the family relocated closer to Broadway. And the Nagels lived next door. You can see they have orchards, and it's prime riverfront property along the Harlem River. They made money harvesting what they called salt hay, just tall grass that grows out of the brackish water, and it was used as a packing material. And as time went on, it became apparent how valuable their land was. The subway was coming north, so by the mid-1800s, they were selling off huge parcels of their land. So the Dykeman house was destroyed, but at the turn of the century, the Nagle homestead was still standing. Interestingly, there was an early preservation movement to make sure that the Nagle house was never destroyed. So again, that's what the area would have looked like when the Dutch settlers arrived in the neighborhood. Kind of a cool painting.
What is that? That's cool.
I didn't note the artist, but I think this is a period piece. And again, that's Inwood Hill. I've got it at home. Henry Hudson Bridge would be right there, and so we're standing up in what would you call this King's Bridge, looking just looking towards New Jersey.
That's great.
Yeah, it's great. And so I told you we were going to look for a fire hydrant, and this is James Preston Moore. He was a member of the Ashcan School, and there's the. Even with this lady walking through the dirt road, and the Dykeman house hasn't been renovated, at least not in this rendition. So the Dykeman house had become a boarding house. The ancestral home fell out of the family and went through something like 10 or 11 owners, and 2 of the surviving Dykeman women realized that the house was still there. It was a boarding house, and they bought it, and they gifted it to the city, and the city's like, this is a wreck. We have no use for this. And so they brought their husbands on board, who were both an engineer and the other was a medievalist, I think. And they renovated the house lovingly. They went upstate and got period piece nails from old barns and gave us the Dykeman house we have today. And when they donated it to the city the second time, the city accepted. And Bolton was involved in pretty much the whole process. So going back to the Nagle home, remember I said the Dykeman home, the original home, had been burned by the British. The Nagle home survived. That's a photograph of it there. They called it the Century House. And again, it was right on the Harlem River. You can see the salt hay growing there. It looks like there's some sort of a ferry boat going up down the Harlem River. 1904, just as they're trying to save the Nagle house, the Century House, it burns to the ground. But the field exploration team, at least the early members, are on site to dig through the remains of the old Century House. And they believe that it had been probably the homestead of Tobias Tunison, one of the very first Dutch settlers before being built over by the Nagels. And in the home, they found a lintel piece that says the initials are Jan, J, Nagle, built May 23rd, 1736. So they can date the home. And this piece of pottery, this teapot, was found in the ruins of the Nagle homestead, and it matches other pieces of property that were found where the hut camp was. So their house had likely been raided and looted. That's the speculation. So you've got several hundred years of colonial settlement, and for a good part of it, slavery was a real thing in New York. We think of it mainly as a southern thing, but it was legal in New York for many years. And in 2020, the past and the present collided. We had the unrest related to the death of George Floyd. And we had monuments coming down, streets being renamed, communities taking a closer look at their own past. And as it would turn out, the Dykeman family, the Vermilia family, the Nagels, were slave owners. You can go into genealogical records, census records, and actually put names to some of these enslaved people. And so the Dykeman house needed to take a closer look at its own history and launched a series of programs where they started a neighborhood dialogue about this. At the same time, the old cemetery, an old cemetery where the colonial settlers had buried their enslaved workers, they were 2 quite different cemeteries, was not rediscovered, but the site for the first time was subject to development. They were trying to decide, should the site be developed at all, or should we build a memorial there? It was ultimately decided that they're going to build, and I don't think ground is broken yet, a homeless shelter.
on the site, and there will be some sort of memorial, a plaque or something, commemorating, what had once been there. But why are we here? Why is history so important? Because in re-examining the location, really the only records to survive of either cemetery came from Bolton and Calver. And what had happened, you can see that clearly the two are not buried together. Those are the colonial families. There's about 413 graves in that one. And this is 20 some odd graves there. But there were crude headstones. There were bones, including the bones of a young child. So the roads are being regraded, subways being built. This is going to need to go for the train yard. Apartment buildings are going to go there. So workers come in, and it's a knoll, and they've been told to just raise the knoll, make it flat, get rid of all these graves. The Field Exploration Committee has been called to the scene, and they're given essentially an afternoon to document, photograph, write down as much as they can before it's lost to history. And they do exactly that. So that's the site we're talking about. And you might walk by it every day and never realize it's there. And once you do, you really can't stop thinking about it. So the enslaved people we're talking about, then these are just the Dykemans. Each family had a handful of enslaved workers. We know the names of some of these. This is Will. This is a runaway ad asking for him back. He's wearing a beaver hat and half-torn trousers. And the ad is placed by Jacob Dykeman in 1765. We know about Francis Cujo. He's being emancipated, and this is really just several years before slavery is going to end, but he's let go a little early, signed by Jacobus Dykeman. And Stats Dykeman. And Stats Dykeman was not very popular with the other Dykemans because he was a British loyalist. When they ultimately moved the colonial cemetery, his was the only grave that wasn't relocated by the Dykeman family. But that's another man named Gilbert Horton that would have been property of the Dykeman family at the time. So you can see the Nagels, where they've got 3 enslaved. These are census records. Another Dykeman has 2. So we know who these people are. We don't know necessarily that they were specifically buried in this cemetery. So the team is called to the site. They've got the afternoon to dig and probe and photograph. And so this is, and they were very sensitive. Bolton always felt, because they were constantly digging up bones from different periods of history, that bones should be decently be reinterred. A human is a human is a human. That's not what happened here. But Mr. Hall and Bolton are of the opinion that humanity and ordinary decency dictate that the remains of the unknown dead be carefully and reverently reburied. This is the New York Daily Tribune, 1903. Also in 1903, New York Times, the bones, such as have not been carried off by relic hunters, lie in a confused mass in an old soapbox near the scene of the work. And it was considered a tragedy even then. So that's the site. This is a good 20 years after the knoll has been raised. Ironically, the site had not been redeveloped. It was all for nothing, really. And if you flash ahead to just this year, the site still hasn't been developed.
Those buildings were just torn down.
Don's saying that these buildings, and these were just corrugated metal and stuff. They weren't real permanent structures to begin with. It was an auto body shop. This has been torn down in preparation for development of the homeless site. And this is IS 98 right next door. And so all of this, I suppose it's proved a teaching moment for all these children. And really, anybody who's been to school there, this seems like a surprise. So yeah, 36 graves were found. And this is just a haunting photo. This is the roads are being graded, and one of the markers is already just tumbled into the roadbed. So, but important work they did in documenting this. So, by comparison, about 20 years later, they need to move the colonial graveyard. The names of the the founding members of the neighborhood, the Dykemans, the Nagels, the people whose streets are named for today. And we're going to go back to Ernest Lawson, because that's the cemetery that we're talking about. This time, they give everybody all the time in the world to try to locate the surviving family members who might be interested in relocating their ancestors' graves. Not too many of them come forward, and Reginald Bolton is given all the time he needs to go in, and I think part of it he receives funding from the city to document exactly whose tombstones were where, give some numbers, names, ages, anything he can copy off the tombstones. And then they're relocated to a plot out in Woodlawn Cemetery where there's a tall granite marker. You can go and visit Woodlawn. It's a city unto itself, and see the actual marker. So, two groups of people with quite different treatment. But kudos to these guys for documenting it. So postscript, we're winding down the presentation here. William Lewis Calver, he was the head of the field committee. Mr. C dies in 1940. He's buried in the place he loved the most, Lackawanna, Pennsylvania, where he learned to be a railroad man. And when I was sifting through his personal effects at the New York Historical Society, I came across this. Turns out it was just kind of a throwaway poem that was published in newspapers for about a 2-year period in the 19-teens, but it was on very rough paper, looked like he had folded it up and put it in his pocket. So I think this is kind of a nice way to close. He wanted a job, and like everyone else, he wanted a good one, where his clothes would not soil and his hands would keep clean, and the salary mustn't be low. He asked for a pen, but they gave him a spade, and he half turned away with a shrug. But he altered his mind, and seizing the spade, he dug. He worked with a will that is bound to succeed, and the months and the years went along. The way it was rough, and the labor was hard, but his heart he kept filled with a song. Some jeered him and sneered at the task, but he plugged. Their words never seemed to disturb him a bit as he dug. The day came at last when they called for the spade and gave him a pen in its place. The joy of achievement was sweet to his taste, and victory shone in his face. We can't always get what we hope for at first. Success cuts many queer jigs, but one thing is sure, a man will succeed if he digs. It's kind of sweet, huh? So, and it's just a beautiful tale. We're watching these two grow old together. The photo on the side is just sweet. They're supporting each other. Bolton died in 1942. Again, he lived in Washington Heights, not too far south of here. And this is just a quote worth noting. The data obtained by Calver, Bolton, and their friends is practically the only archaeological record of the Revolutionary War in New York City where so much once existed. No wonder Calver and Bolton are almost legendary today. And that's a drawing by by Bolton there. I would think if you were an archaeologist, it would make a nice tattoo. So their greatest hits, and this was put together after their deaths, and they're only it's a collection of their just stories about their finds, their techniques. Each one is about 2 or 3 pages long, and it's just chock full of information about the neighborhood. And a lot of this stuff, this old stuff, you can find online. It's a Google search away. And more modern reading material, Mannahatta is a great history with all kinds of activities, even for children contained within, and just drawings and just beautiful portraits of what Manhattan would have looked like before European settlement. And then Unearthing Gotham, this came out, it must be 20 years old at this point, but it explores digs not just in the neighborhood, and it does get into Bolton and Calver, but stuff from other boroughs as well. So that's it for this month. Thank you for coming out. Don and I wrote this book a little while ago. We have copies. Thank you again. And tip your wait staff.